welcome everybody. I'm going to try really hard to, the topics that I'm going to talk about today and the next 2 days are not regionally dependent. So it doesn't matter if you're in Florida or from Iowa, the rules or the guidelines that we'll talk about will apply no matter where. And I try really hard when I talk about design to make them more about the design principles and not about specific plants, because I want to make sure it applies to, like I said, no matter where you live. Because even in Iowa, we have 2 different zones. So it's nice to be able to apply them where you can. So like Alicia said, I'm Lisa Nunamaker, and I work at Iowa State in the horticulture department, which is pretty cool. I teach landscape design there. And I also have my website, a paper garden workshop that I've had for many years. And if you want to learn about design, definitely check my site out. I have a lot of free information on there, so you're welcome to take a peek at that. And I'm trying to think, I might just go ahead and start sharing my screen, if that is okay. Oh, I can, oh, here we go. I'm fighting, Alicia and I are fighting with who's going to share the screen. So let's see. It's so funny, like we all do this when we're trying to share our screens. I'm getting there. Okay, here we go. Perfect. So tonight we're going to talk about planting design tips. And like Alicia had mentioned, in the next couple of weeks, I'll build on this. You do not have to be here tonight to necessarily do the other ones, but they all do relate to each other. So I'll be talking about just basic design tips tonight. And then next Tuesday, we'll be talking about advanced planting models or advanced planting design. So how you would take plants and put them in a more advanced, I kind of call them templates, or kind of models that you can use as a starting point when you assemble plants. That's next week. And then the week after that, I like to talk a little bit about landscape graphics and how you draw plants in plan view. We'll probably talk a little bit about elevation. Also, elevation is when you look at something when you're standing in front of it, and plan view is looking down. So I might just cover a little bit of both of those, but I like you to be able to draw what you're envisioning in your brain. So when you install designs for yourself or for other people, then you can at least communicate with that, with what your ideas are on paper also, which is really cool. And just so you know, Alicia will probably look at the chat, and we might cover most of these questions at the end, but if we see something that relates to what we're talking about, we might catch it. There's so many of you, I might miss some, but she's going to keep track for us. So if I don't catch it, we'll cover most of them at the end also. Okay, and I have to make sure I see my clock because I am notorious for losing track of time. So I'm just going to move my stuff over on my screen so I can see what we're doing. Perfect. So let's start talking about design tips so we can get through all this great information. So this is where I like to start. So let's back up a second here. So we're going to talk about planting design tonight and the next 2 sessions. But what I'd like to do is just talk a little bit about the difference between spatial design and planting design, because landscape design is pretty big. And there's a big picture view, and there's a very specific view. And I want to make sure we understand these terms, because tonight we'll be talking about planting design, but oftentimes we kind of skip the spatial design. And really in the end, you should really be doing spatial design first and then do planting design. So let's talk about that. Does anybody know, you can just throw it in the chat. Does anybody know what spatial design is? And you can just take a guess, couple words, what you think it might be. I'm always curious to see if anybody knows what that actually is. And I'm just going to kind of wait here a second to see if anybody, space. Good job, Cheryl. So how things occupy the space. Oh, excellent. Placement of beds designed for your space. Excellent, Sharon and Lynn. And planning based on the space you have available. Excellent, Erin. So yeah, these are all excellent. That is exactly what it is. It's about creating the overall plan and creating the spaces and the rooms in your garden. So instead of just going to the store and buying plants and then putting them in the ground, we're actually creating the lawn shapes, the rooms first, before we actually get to anything about garden or planting design. So I'm going to show a little bit of some examples of this. And of course, but today we're going to talk about planting design, but I will probably spend the next 5 minutes or so just talking about spatial design, because I think it's important that when you are picking plants, you understand how planting design supports spatial design. So spatial design in the simplest terms is we're creating outdoor rooms, okay? We're creating these spaces. Whereas planting design is we're organizing the plants within the beds. So we're thinking of form, texture, and color. These are the basic elements of planting design. And for those that are master gardeners, you probably have learned about this already. Your plants are also really important for reinforcing the spaces. So I will talk a lot about outdoor rooms and how rooms are floors, walls, and ceilings. That's the basic premise of landscape design. We're creating an outdoor room. So once you understand that, everything else kind of falls into place, which is really cool. So when you pick plants, you think about how they're reinforcing the spaces you're creating. So here's an example of that. We have a little backyard area, and we have a laundry yard on the left. And then we have a little reading nook, and we have a little picnic lawn space. And you can see the spaces are the rooms. So this laundry yard is a room in itself. The lawn is basically defining where that space is, the light green color. And then you've got the plants around, and the plants around them are the walls, but that's also where planting design is happening. So today we're going to be talking about, and next week, we'll be talking about the plants and how you arrange them in the beds, but to know that those beds are reinforcing the plantings or the rooms. Okay, so I love showing this slide because it explains how we often create negative spaces in our yards. Instead of consciously thinking about what that lawn space and what our room looks like, we often will just start planting things and just kind of putting things here and there. And then all of a sudden we have this leftover space. Whereas what we should really be doing is designing the lawn space first, or designing the patio. I think a lot of us are good at designing a patio or designing a deck, but when it comes to lawn, we don't always think about designing the lawn first, like we would a deck or a patio. We just let it be whatever space it is after we put the plants down. But what I would love for you to switch your thought process to is, how can I design the rooms first, which is the lawn spaces, and then have the plants around them. That's a big thing to learn. I know my own college students struggle with it a little bit. But once they kind of get over that hump of thinking, oh yeah, we're designing a room, we're not just putting beds around a house, where the beds are the edge of a space. So this is my own backyard. We bought our house about 1.5 years ago. Actually, it's been about 1.5 years ago. And the first thing we did was decide what spaces do we need. We wanted an outdoor eating area. So that on the drawings on the left is me taking photos from my second-story window, putting tracing paper over it, and then just drawing out the spaces we wanted. So I'm not really thinking about the plants a whole lot about what they are. I'm thinking about, I want a dining area. We wanted a dining area, and then way in the back, I don't know if you can see it way in the back, we actually have a sitting area with a fire pit and some chairs. So we knew we wanted a dining area and then an area in the back. So I'm not thinking about what plants these are yet. I just know I want these spaces for these rooms, and eventually I'm going to put plants around them. And then the one on the right would be from I think that was last fall, it was 1 year ago. And you can see we got the hardscapes in first. We did gravel and limestone, and then we got the furniture. And then this last summer, we've spent time putting the plants in. They're not all in, it'll take a few years. So it's really important, again, that you're doing the spatial design first, trying to decide what are your spaces, what are they being used for? And then for me, the plants take many years to fill in around them. It's the hardscapes first. So hopefully that makes sense in terms of spatial design and how to move that direction. So here's another example. This is one of my students' projects. But again, you can see the lawn is very purposeful. It's designed, and so is the patio, and the plants go around that. And then here's some other examples of more informal plantings. Even informal plantings, the lawn is very designed and purposeful. So that is spatial design. So hopefully you can leave tonight at least understanding that we're working with garden rooms, and that's a whole nother presentation. And you can go on my website to learn about spatial design. I actually have a whole series of articles on how you lay out your rooms. So once you have your rooms laid out, we can talk about planting design. And planting design, of course, is arranging the plants in the beds that reinforce the spaces. So here's an example of that. So here is a lawn space right in the middle. It's on a rectangle diagonal. And that's our space. So we've created the room, and now we're going to use the plants in the beds around it to reinforce those spaces. Okay, so you can see there's lots of plants in here, and they're arranged in many ways. I mean, we'll talk about the different ways you can arrange them, but again, here are some examples of planting design and how they're the edge of the space and how they're creating that space. And here's just more examples. So this one's in Santa Fe. You can do really simple designs. You can do very complicated designs. This is in Boston. There's lots of ways, obviously, as we all know, we can do planting design. And that's what's fun about plants. You know, hardscapes are one thing, you put them in the ground and they pretty much stay there, but plants are a bigger challenge in a fun way, because obviously they're living and they move and they grow and they die. And there's all kinds of fun things that you can do with plants. But let's talk about the function of plants really quick. Does anybody know why you would have plants in your garden? Like, what are some thoughts? Like, why would you grow? What's the purpose of plants? There's lots of reasons, but what are some of your thoughts on why you grow plants in your garden? And I'm going to see in the chat here as I come through. Pest control, that's a good one. Pest control, peace and quiet, I love it. Food for insects, for color, for smell, for beauty and privacy. Beauty, love it. Eye candy, I love that. Bring joy, softened spaces, aesthetics, awesome. Food, natural fencing, that's a good one. Awesome. Meditation, pollination, excellent. So carbon capture, this is excellent. So all of these are exactly on, and you will find that we all have different reasons for why we include plants like we do. Reducing the lawn, excellent. Restful on the eyes, so prevent soil erosion. That's a very functional reason. So you will realize that there's very functional reasons for having plants, more aesthetic reasons. So there's different reasons why you might have plants in your garden or in your landscape. Oops, let's get back on here. So of course, one of them is the screen views. I think one person had mentioned that providing shade, that's a really important one. A lot of us will put a large tree in because we want to have that shade in our yard. Controlling circulation patterns. So it may not necessarily control it perfectly. Like if you have children or dogs, they might still run across, but in general, if you have a walkway like the image here, you can kind of direct somebody and tell them where they need to go. And people are pretty good about following that. And you can direct guests to your front door. So one of the reasons we do landscape design in the front yard is because we want to direct people to the entry of the house. So that's just another interesting hint or thing you can use tonight is when you do landscaping in the front, it's always for, not always, but usually it's to guide people to your front door. It's to frame your house. And of course that, like someone said, eye candy, it's to blend into the neighborhood also, whatever your interpretation of that is. So plants are used in many of those ways also for the front entry. And then of course, somebody had mentioned wildlife habitat and food and many of these other things I didn't even mention. A lot of you brought up other things that I didn't even include, and they're all correct. And of course, like I mentioned, plants also define space. So you have many different reasons why you would have plants. And I think it's important for you to think about why you're installing a garden. What is the purpose of it? Is it just to add aesthetics? Is it because you want to grow food? Is it because you want to define an outdoor room? A lot of our outdoor plants, I'm doing it because I want to define the spaces that we have, and I want it to be more of a plant community. So a lot of the plants that we're creating in the back of the groups of plants are for those reasons, and they're shade. It's a shade garden back there. So we have a lot of shade plants also. But yeah, you want to make sure you're defining the space. No matter what you're doing, you want to think about that also. So here's another example in graphics view from the plan view, looking up and looking down. I'm not looking up. You're standing above the garden, looking down in plan view. So of course, here's our garden. That is our outdoor space. And then you can see how the plants are all placed around it to emphasize that space. So I want to make sure I explain that even though I keep talking about spaces and their importance, spaces are important, but also plants are also important because they are reinforcing those spaces. So they are both integral to each other. So here's another great design. I always like to ask people, when they look at designs, do you think that the garden or the lawn space, like in this picture, was it designed or was it just left over? I always like to ask you that question, because as you look at gardens, always think about, how could I have done this better? How could I have cleaned those lines? Or maybe you don't have lawn at all, and you don't have to have lawn. You can just have a patio. We do not have lawn at all in our backyard because it's too shady. And we're not going to have lawn in our front yard. I'm not against lawn. And I want to make sure I stress that, because sometimes lawn is nice for kids and playing football and soccer. And we had lawn for a long time because of that, but our kids are older now, so we don't need it as much, or if you have dogs. But if you are going to have lawn, I think it's important to think about the shape of that lawn. And it's beautiful. Lawn is a good resting point for your eye also, which I love. So again, there's many reasons for plants, but now I'm going to talk to you about how you can arrange them. And these are just some tips. I have 10 plus because I keep adding them. And I almost added one more before we started this presentation. I'm like, no, I'll wait till next week to cover that one. But I can just go on and on about different planting tips. There are so many more than we can even cover today, but the ones I've chosen today, I feel are the most important in terms of just starting. Okay. So hopefully that'll help you to at least get started. So tip number one is massing plants rather than having one of everything. And I know a lot of you have heard this before. You see it all the time. And even though we hear it, we don't always do it. A lot of us, we're here because we love plants and we want to have as many as possible. And a lot of us are collectors of plants, which is really awesome. And what happens is you tend to have one of everything when you want just one of that, one of this. And when you're at a sale, you want to pick one of each of the sale items. But when you mass everything, it actually unifies your design. And we're not going to talk about design principles a lot tonight, but there will be certain ones that'll keep popping up. Unity is one of them, and repetition. And when you repeat something over and over again, you unify a design. And in this case, it's plant materials. It can also be color. It can be other things, which we'll talk about soon. But when you mass plants, it is more unified and you don't have these onesie things everywhere. So when you have too many specimens, your eye is just all over the place. So when you have a design like this, where things are massed and you have groups of plants, it just feels more unified. Now you can go to the hilt. Like this is a very simple design, and this one before it was actually a little bit, let's go back, was a little bit busier, but in general though, there's still massing plants and it still feels unified. And this is a little simpler, and this is even more simpler. But even though this is a simple design, we have some alliums in there, and I don't know what other plants are in there, but there's probably still quite a few plants in here. But visually, it looks unified, and because we're massing them, it pulls it all together. So don't be afraid when you go to the store and your local nursery has a sale, and you see like, oh, I want to get one of everything. Try really hard to at least get 3 of something when you buy it. Or if you're lucky, you can buy a plant that's easily divided. So, an allium, for instance, is an easily dividable plant. So maybe there's only one of them there, but maybe when you get home, you can divide it into 3. And then over the years, you can divide it more and more, and then have more of a massing of a plant versus just one of them. But at least try to buy 3 if you can. It's nice if you can at least do that. And then here's some more examples of, this is drift planting. We'll talk about this more next week. But again, just planting things in masses and drifts really unify. And just so you know, planting in massing does not mean it has to be informal. If you're someone that likes formal designs, you can do this in a formal setting too, by creating rows of plants like in hedges. And by simplifying it, it gives it more of a modern approach or a contemporary approach, versus if you have more of the drift plantings, like I mentioned earlier, shown earlier, that are more informal. So you can do a lot of things with massing, which is really cool. So that's one of the ones that I think is the easiest to implement. And it's really important. And here I like to show what the graphics look like also when you do planting design. This is plan view again. And when you mass plants in plan view in a drawing, you basically have, so these are plant symbols, a circle. You basically would connect the same plant and eliminate the lines in between. And we'll be talking about graphics more in 2 weeks. And I'll probably send you some kind of a packet or something that you can practice while we're talking, or some kind of a workbook that you can use later. But when you're grouping plants visually, graphically, it's nice if you can get rid of the lines in between the same plants, because then you can look at a design and be like, oh yeah, that's a group of plants. I can see that now. So we'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks, but I do like to show you what that looks like in plan view also in a drawing. Okay, let's go to number 2, because if I don't keep going, I'll never finish. But number 2 is planting in odd numbers. So this is very similar to the first one because you are repeating more than one plant. And a lot of you have probably heard about this guideline or this. I don't want to say it's a rule because sometimes I even break it. But in general, it's nice to plant in odd numbers. Now, this only really relates to lower numbers. So plants from like 3 to 7-ish, you can do odd numbers. But once you get over 7, 8, 9, 10, your eye doesn't see it as odd numbers or even numbers anymore. So it's really just for the lower numbers that it's important. And the reason being, I have read that it's because when you see a group of 2 plants, for some reason, our brain separates it out as 2 plants. You don't see it as a mass, you see it as 2 plants. Even 4 plants, for some reason, our brain sees it as 2 plants and 2 plants or 4 plants. But when you have an odd number, your eye doesn't break it, your brain doesn't break it apart anymore. Now you're seeing it as a mass, which I think is really interesting. So when you have 3 plants, our brain doesn't want to divide it anymore. But when you have 4 plants, your brain wants to divide the group. And that's why when you have more than 7 or 8, it doesn't matter anymore because our brain can't do it at high numbers. So when you have smaller numbers like this, it just looks more like a mass when you have it in groups of odd numbers. So let me show you examples of this. So again, here are some great, beautiful examples of massing. And if you were to count these up, these sedums on the left are actually, there's 5 there. And again, these other plants, there's so many, you can't even tell how many there are, but the idea is if you can put them in those odd numbers when you mass them, at least for the smaller groupings, you can't feel like it's this thing that you can split up in your brain. And you want plants to touch, and we'll talk more about this in a second. Oh, someone asked me about symmetry. I'm going to answer that question, Sharon, in a second here. So hold on, because I am going to talk about that. So here's some more examples of odd numbers and massing, because really these first two guidelines go together. This is Adam Woodruff, and he's in Missouri, and he's amazing. If you don't follow him on Instagram, you should definitely do that. He's a great designer. And we'll talk more about him next week also. So here's an example of how the rule of 3, it doesn't matter if it's an informal planting or a formal planting. So here's what's very formal. And these 3 topiaries in the front, how odd that would look if it was only 2 versus 3. So there's just something about balancing when you have that odd number. So here's the answer to the question. Someone asked, what about symmetry? You can definitely have symmetry. And symmetry is a formal style, and you can definitely do formal styles in landscape design. So the question that I always get is, so let's look at an example of this house, and we have some plants on both sides. We have plants here and here. Oops, I just lost them. We have these 2 plants here, but we also have these 2 containers. Now, when you're looking at this, and I'm like, well, there's 2 plants here. Am I breaking the rules? Does anybody know if I'm breaking the rules or not? Just tell me if I'm breaking the rule by writing yes or no. Am I breaking the rule by having this plant here and this plant here? There's 2 of them. Tammy says no. We have a lot of no's. Everyone's just saying what everybody else is saying, probably, right? No, and I wish we could talk more in person. This is where I wish we could interact more in person. So does anybody know why it's no? It is, you're correct. It is no. Oh, that's interesting, Carrie. So someone says it's got 3 on each side. Someone said there's balance. It directs the eye there, and Elsa has it. It's 1 and 1. That's the other ones are correct too. But to get down to the purest part of what we're talking about in terms of odd numbers, this is not a grouping of 2. This is a grouping of 1 and a grouping of 1. So we're not breaking any rules here because it's an odd number. And they're not touching. So if they're not touching, they're technically 2 different groups. So Elsa, you were correct on that. But yeah, basically, and yes, the balance is correct and all of that also. So symmetry is perfectly fine. You can have a group of 3 plants on one side and a group of 5 plants on the other. That's perfectly fine because you're still doing odd numbers. This is where we get into design principles and balance. And we're not going to talk a lot about that today. Balance is one of those things that you can have symmetry and asymmetry at the same time. It's kind of a weird thing, but that's a whole nother discussion. But yes, you can have a symmetrical design and follow both of these first rules, which is really cool. So yeah, I love this example. And so many people asked me that question that I finally threw this slide in, which is really nice. Okay, so massing and odd numbers, at least for the lower numbers of groups or number of quantity. So the number 3 is we're going to start talking about the elements of garden design or planting design, which is form, texture, and color. So number 3 is about form. And I think, Alicia, you said you gave everybody the handout that I had. So hopefully you have that handout and it has all of these on there if you need to take notes, but you'll see that 3, 4, and 5 are form, texture, and color. And these 3 things are really important in terms of planting design. And one thing that I do want to mention is that the order that I have them in is the order of importance or significance of them in the garden. So form is the most significant. Second is texture, and then color. And some of you might be like, what? Color's third? How can that even be? Does anybody know why form is the most important in terms of planting design between form, texture, and color? Pat's asking about the handouts. And Peggy's asking. So Peggy, we will get you a handout if we haven't yet, so don't worry about that. So does anybody know why form is the most important? Form transcends seasons. I like how you said that. And form equals volume. Excellent. And I know I shouldn't stop. I guess the handouts were in an email. So hopefully if you didn't get them, you'll grab them in your email later. So I like how whoever said that form transcends seasons, form is the only thing that will be there year round. Okay. So when you are designing with plants, especially, okay, if you're in Florida, this probably doesn't matter. Well, it still matters. Form is still important, whether you're in Florida or in Iowa. But for those of you that are in a situation where we have winter, form is even more important, because when you are designing a planting bed, you want to have interest year round. And form is one of those things that stays year round. Texture would be second. That's probably the next consistent. And then color is the least consistent, because as you know, color comes and goes throughout the season, especially if you're depending on flowers to be your like exciting thing for the entire garden, and you're working with perennials, you can't depend on those colors to be there all year unless you're putting annuals in, or the foliage is a certain color that you want. So let me show you some of it. Let me show you some examples of form. First, really quick, I want to show you a collection of different plant forms. If you don't know this, I want you to remember this forever. When you are doing planting design, it's important to understand that all plants have a form. And this is integral. This is the secret that no one can tell anybody else. This is between us. I want to make sure that you know that all plants have a form. So when you learn a new plant, understand what the form is. And I know some nurseries are doing a great job of explaining this better when you sell plant. When you order from a catalog, it's really important that you understand, is it pyramidal? Is it columnar? Is it round? Is it vase-shaped? Is it spreading? Is it weeping? So it's important for you to know all those plant forms. So when you make a composition of plant forms and you want to repeat forms and you want variety for interest, that's what makes a composition really fun. So here's an example of an elevation drawing. So an elevation, again, is you're standing in front and you're looking towards the view that you're designing. And I love this as an example of plant forms, because this is the same shed in both designs, but I'm taking plant forms and I'm changing them to emphasize that doorway or to emphasize the building. And if you design with plant form in mind first, it doesn't matter if something's blooming or not, it's going to look amazing. And actually, texture is right up there with form. Texture is also amazing. So just as an FYI, on my website, I teach a lot about graphics. I think graphics are important, being able to convey your designs. So these actually are from a class that I teach online, Garden Graphics Toolkit, and I'm teaching it here soon. So if anybody wants to learn about these things, I'm letting you know, because I only teach it once a year and it's coming up again here soon. But this is the types of things that I think are really important in design, is to be able to see things in elevation like this and in plan view. It's very powerful when you can see things in elevation. So hopefully this helps with actually seeing plant forms. So here's an example of some plant forms in this photo. And I'm going to highlight some of them so you can see. You see the house on the left, you see the red door, and you see this gravel walkway going into that area. And the ones that I just circled are low mounding type plants. But what makes it interesting, this design, is that you also have some rounder upright plants. And the coolest part about this whole design is that you have these pyramidal plants in the back. And I love this because the way that you're being pulled to the front door, you may not, I mean, yes, we can see the door from this view, but you may not be able to see the view from some where you're standing. So by having the door red and by having those two pyramidal plants, it actually brings you into the space, which is really cool, and brings you to that front door. So here's another great example of that. These three pyramidal or columnar plants, they just kind of bring you in. So by having a variety of different forms, but also repeating them is so important. It's really, really neat to see this. And then here's some more examples of some low moundy plants. And then you have the round plants behind them. And we even have some clipped hedges on the right. If you clip a hedge, you can clip it obviously in any form that you want. I'm not against clip hedges. I love clipped hedges, but I would really encourage you to learn the natural forms of plants so you can use them to your advantage. Because you don't, for those of you that actually do designs for clients, you don't ever want to ask someone to keep a plant in a certain shape. If you can actually understand the shape of the plant naturally and work with it, that always works well. Even though I love a good hedge. So I don't want to, I'm not against them. I just think it's important to have a mix. So again, here's another great image. And what I love about this picture is that this plant right here in on the middle left really stands out because the texture and the form are just a little bit different. So when you're in a great space, I encourage you to look around and say, why do I like these plants? Is it because the plant forms are interesting? Is it because the textures are interesting? Because form, texture, and color are, like, again, the main elements that you want to think about when planting design. And when they're done well, they're really done well. So here's plant forms in a container also. And a lot of you have probably heard of the thriller, filler, spiller idea. Those three words are describing the form of the plant. So you have an upright plant, you have a moundy plant, and then you have a weeping or a spilling plant. So that's the whole idea of plant forms in containers also. Okay, now let's talk about plant textures. So we have plant forms, which is number one, that's the most consistent. Plant textures. I love plant textures. I'm obsessed with plant textures. And I'm liking plant forms are incredibly fun too. But in the simplest sense, it's about combining large leaves and small leaves. Now, I'm oversimplifying this. I will tell you that right now. I am very much oversimplifying it, but I feel like it's a great place to start with texture. You want contrast. So you want to mix large leaves and small leaves. So here's an example of that. This first leaf is a larger leaf, and then as you get across, it gets more fine. So the terms that we use are coarse, texture, medium, and fine. And I want to explain that these are all relative. So in Florida, you're going to have their coarse leaves might be way bigger than our coarse leaves here, because we don't have humongous tropical plants unless you plant, cannas or something for the summer. But you want to just make sure that you are mixing at least large leaves and small leaves. I did not understand this concept when I was in college. It took me, actually, when I started working at Ryman Gardens, which is our botanic garden at Iowa State, when I started seeing the horticulturalists there combine these plants, I'm like, oh my gosh, the light bulb went up. I'm like, this is exactly why I was confused, because I did not understand like how leaves work together. And I always think it's cool. Like if you don't have any color in a garden, if you have great texture and great form, you have an amazing garden. So here's a great example of that. This is all greens. And look at the lamb's ears. They have really large leaves. And then we have the really thin, small leaves behind them. And it's a combination of those that make this a strong design. Now, one of the weakest design combinations I feel, and some of you could maybe pull this off and do it well, are grasses and daylilies. Like they're too similar to me. You want to mix a grass with something with a larger leaf, or a daylily with a larger leaf, or even a different kind of leaf. Like having two long leaves like that are very similar are almost too similar. So you want to mix up the size, not only the size, but sometimes the shape also of the leaf. So here's some more examples of that. The leaves on the left are more fine, and the leaves on the right are just a little bit bigger. They're not humongously bigger, but they're just different enough that they really stand out. And here's some other examples. I like to show these because the picture on the left This is an allium in the back on the right side and I'm sorry, on the left side, but in the back of this picture is allium. And then there's some thyme on the bottom. They're both fine texture, but they work together because they have different shape leaves also. So start with large and small leaves just as a starting point, but then at some point when you get really advanced with texture, you're also looking at the size of the leaf itself, and you want to make sure you mix them. And of course, the lady's mantle leaves are humongous and they look beautiful against these. So things like iris are difficult, but if you mix them with like a coreopsis, you have like a larger leaf bearded iris, but then you have a really tiny coreopsis leaf. That's a nice combination also. So again, it's just mixing those leaves to make sure there's some interest there. Okay, so here's some more examples. The one thing I want to mention about this one is that the lady's mantle, the lady's mantle in the front, it has a coarse leaf when there's no bloom, but when it blooms, it has a fine flower. So sometimes you have to work with plants that have two different textures at different parts of the season, and that's okay. And this is where form holds it all together. Because you have these upright plants working with these moundy plants, it doesn't matter that the texture is changing. Now you still have the forms that are holding it together. So that's why it's important to think about all three of those elements: form, texture, and color. Texture can also be in hardscape. So this is a great example. You might put a large stone next to a fine textured plant, and that really is a nice combination also. And here's a great other example: small textured or fine textured leaves with the larger leaves. And I, in my own garden, I don't have sun anymore as much as I used to, but I used to use lamb's ears a lot just because of the texture, I'll be honest. It's a common plant, but boy, you can't beat a large leaf like that in our climate. So it's really nice. We obviously have hostas and things too, but if you're in the sun, you can't use that as much. So here's some more examples. Here's a container. This is at Magnolia, actually, in Waco, Texas. Their horticultural stuff is amazing. And I just love, again, these are annuals, but again, you're mixing the large leaves with the small leaves. Even in a planter box, it looks amazing. And again, large leaves with tiny leaves. So when you're visiting gardens, always look at the textures and see what looks good together. When you go to a nursery and you're buying plants, I do this all the time. We'll do an entire bed. I don't always plant entire beds, but when we go there, I do this all the time. I put the plants together at the nursery and I make sure the leaves are contrasting before I buy the plants. If they're all fine textured, I have to take one of them out and put in a large leaf plant. You want to make sure you have a mix. Okay, so let's talk about color now, as I'm looking at the time, and I want to make sure we get through these. So when choosing colors, the biggest suggestion I have for you is to try to limit your color choices. Think about, am I going to do, all pinks, or maybe I'm going to have a theme and I'm going to do, a lemonade garden, and it's going to be, maybe like whites and yellows or something like that. If you limit your color choices, it actually is easier to choose plants. And I will be honest, even though form and texture are the most consistent, I will use color to initially choose my plants because I have to narrow them down somehow. And color is the best way to do that. So besides cultural preferences, of course, I'm assuming you're already looking at shade and sun and wet and dry and all of that. But once you get to the aesthetics part of it, I'll use color to narrow down my plant choices. And then when I have a pool of plants, then I'll go through them and make sure I have good texture and good form also. So here's some examples of different color combinations. Look at the color wheel. It's a great inspirational thing. That's why we have our color wheel. You can do monochromatic color schemes, which is all the same colors. You can do opposites on the color wheel: oranges and blues, purples and yellows, reds and greens. Basically, the complementary colors are the Bears, the Vikings, and Christmas. Basically, those are the colors combinations, but they're really bright and bold. If you don't want bright and bold, go with colors that are on the same side of the color wheel, analogous colors. So, orange, or all the warm colors, all the cool colors look nice together. You can do fall color tones like this. But if you just kind of go with one kind of theme, your colors just look really beautiful together. And think about your house colors too. Like what colors would you choose that look good with your house also? You can do things like silvers and grays, which are absolutely stunning. And especially if you go with silvers and grays, texture and form are even more important because, again, you don't have the colors coming and going. Here's warm colors, which are absolutely stunning. You can do things with your furniture and your architecture, like I mentioned. For instance, they painted this bench red, and they did it purposefully because they knew these plants were going to bloom red. So to think about when your plants are blooming, what other elements in your landscape, whether it's flower containers or fences or a bench, like how do they all work together when they're blooming? It looks really cool when you think about that. This is one of my favorite gardens. This is in Memphis, and her colors were purple and yellow, but you can see the colors. We have purple foliage, we have yellow flowers, and even the bench has purple in it. And she was very selective in how she chose these colors and where she placed them. So this, I love this. It's a beautiful garden. If you haven't had a chance, go to the Cooper Young Garden Walk in Memphis, Tennessee. It's in May, and it's an amazing garden tour, like over 75 gardens. And they're all these really fun, like eclectic gardens. They're just great. Anyway, one of my favorite places to go. It's a fun place. Cooper Young Garden Walk. Okay, next thing, heights. Make sure you consider all different heights of plants. I think we're really good at doing the taller plants. What I don't want you to forget are the small plants in the front. So this is at Duke Gardens in North Carolina, and you can see these really small plants in the front. Don't forget about those plants. Don't forget about the plants that creep over the edge, especially over a hardscape. I think over a lawn, it's a little more challenging because you have to mow it. But if you have a patio or a walk, have the plants creep over. And I love those little plants. Those are the ones I get the most compliments on, are the little plants that kind of creep over out of the garden and into the walkway. And if you plant it right and you plant them tight enough, these keep the weeds down too. So if you can include that ground cover layer, and we'll talk about this more next week, when you're thinking vertically with your plants, make sure you have that green, they call it a green mulch, that actually holds down a lot of those plants that you don't want to have in your gardens also. But aesthetically, it looks beautiful too. I call it the trim of the garden. So this is another great example of that. This is in Santa Fe with the lavender in the back, but I just love having some kind of a trim or plant that creeps over. This one's in Boston, but isn't this beautiful? I just love how they go between the steps or the stepping stones, but then they're also creeping over the edge. It's such a beautiful detail. So here's another one that I think is it as important depending on where you live, but winter interest is important also, especially in our climate. But one of the things that I do want to mention with winter interest, put your winter interest where it counts. So if you're someone that lives with a big lawn, a big yard, and it goes back an acre, I don't know if you need to have winter interest way in the back where you never go, unless you cross country ski a lot and you're always back there. Put the winter interest where it counts, like maybe at your front door, or maybe you walk in the side door from the garage all the time. So you might want to have plants with a lot of cool berries and twigs and bark and interesting things. Of course, berries themselves are good for animals also. So, but if you're thinking in terms of aesthetics, put the winter interest where it's going to count. So you don't need to put it everywhere in your yard. Put it where you're going to appreciate it. Maybe you have a patio right outside your kitchen. Maybe you have some sliding doors and you have a patio from your kitchen out. Maybe you put plants there because you can see them when you're eating breakfast in the morning. So again, think about where you see these plants. So it makes more sense if you're going to put the effort into them. And there's a lot of great plants. Obviously, red twig dogwoods, yellow twig dogwoods, heathers, lots of berries. I mean, there's so many neat plants that you can use for winter interest. And I kind of mentioned this already a little bit with your plants touching, but number 8 is just filling your beds with plants. And there's a lot of reasons for this. One is aesthetically, your beds look better when their plants are touching and they're masked. The other reason is to keep the weeds down. I just mentioned this with the ground covers, but if you grow, if your plants are touching and your layers, you actually have a lower ground cover layer under your plants, long-term, that's going to make the maintenance of your beds a little bit easier. Now, some of you probably do this already. I did it out of necessity with my own garden many years ago because it was just easier to have the beds be as full as possible because I didn't have to do as much. It took a few years to get to that point, but once they filled in, it was heaven. So if you can fill your beds, do that, because if you have a bed like this, what usually happens? Like these weeds start popping up and they just keep popping up and then you have to weed it all the time. So I always tell my students, if you're going to put a bed in, put a plant in there that you want, not these weeds. These are more weeds just popping up in the beds. Like don't even have a bed, just have lawn if you're gonna let weeds pop up. So if you're gonna have a bed, fill it with plants so it can look like this. Like this is more awesome. There might be weeds in here, but I don't see them. Who cares if there's weeds because they're covered with the plants that you want. This is my old house. This is our front bed in the old house, and it's been changed many, many times. But again, we filled it so much that I didn't have to worry about weeds a whole lot. In the spring, I had to weed a little bit when the plants first came up, but then the rest of the year, much easier. I'm not saying it's no maintenance. There's no such thing as a no maintenance garden, but it helps a lot to make it a lower maintenance garden. So again, more examples of just putting lots of plants in your landscape. Believe it or not, this garden is in Boston, not in Florida. They have a lot of tropicals in here, but I love how they just fill everything up. So here's more examples of that. Filling your beds. We're going to keep that in your brain to fill your beds. So this is my backyard. So I showed you at the beginning that actual table, that little space that we created. And this is this summer. It looks really lush. I will be honest, it still has a lot of empty beds, but we are getting there. And again, we are trying to fill the beds as much as we can. So long-term, we don't have to worry about trying to weed everything. Of course, it's shade. Shade's a little bit easier anyway, but it's fun to do that. So here's just a planting plan, again, of filling your beds. And the weakness in this planting design right here is under this shrub right here, or this little tree. I should have put some plants there too, but these little blobs that I'm drawing, I'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks. These are ground covers. So you don't have to draw circles for ground covers. You can just do blob shapes. But again, we'll cover that more later. Okay, so layering plants. Now, for number 9, I'm talking about layering in terms of from the front to the back. Next week, we'll be talking about layering from the bottom to the top. So you can do layering both ways, and I think both ways is important. But what I want to get across with this tip is making sure that we actually have more than 3 feet for our planting bed. If you have a 2-story house, don't be afraid to have a bed that's 7 to 10 feet wide away from that. If you have the space, sometimes we don't have the space. But it's fun if you can actually have some space to put some plants and have more than just one layer. Like maybe you have a really small one in the front, and then you have another layer and then another layer, and actually work your way back to fit the scale of the house. Now, layers don't have to be informal like this. They can be very formal also. So again, any of these guidelines apply to formal design or informal design. It doesn't matter. And then this is a house in Seattle, and they just filled their entire front yard with layers of plants, which is fun. This is the side yard of that same house. Again, lots of layers. There's lots of interest here, which is really fun. And again, just showing more of those layers and how you don't just have to have one thing. You can actually work your way back and have multiple layers, which is so much fun. So yeah, Sharon, as in short, medium, and tall plants. Thank you for saying that. So when you're looking at any of these, you want to have shorter plants. If you're looking at it from a certain view, maybe you want to have shorter plants in the front, taller in the back. If it's something that you can walk through, you might have a mix of tall and short within the middle. So yeah, you want to have a mix of taller and shorter plants, but you also want, when I say layer, I also mean I want to think about depth of your bed also. So a lot of us will have like a 3-foot wide bed in front of our house, but think about having wider beds instead of just having a short little bed. You want to have long, or not long, but wide beds instead. And sometimes you can't. I'm looking at Paula's. This is a great one, Paula. Unfortunately, her municipality requires that at least 50% of the yard must be turf. And I totally get that. And what you can do is just make sure, and turf isn't bad necessarily, but I understand if you don't have a lot of space, you just do what you can. Maybe you work with smaller plants, or you tuck more of the little ground cover plants in instead to get more of that layering feeling, which is really fun too. Sometimes we have to get really creative. Okay. So the number 10 is basically the idea of sometimes we do have the opportunity to do a long planting border, and we get overwhelmed with what do we put in this long bed, like maybe along a long driveway or along a fence. One of the things that I suggest to people to simplify is to just repeat plants. So maybe for 5 feet of it, you design something and you love it. So then you just repeat that 5-foot design as a block all the way down. So this idea is just about how do I design just a small section instead, and then just repeat it over and over and over. So this is at Longwood Gardens. I know this is an outside, but I still think it's a great example of just picking a style, like a pattern, and then you can just repeat that over and over, whatever that might be. This is a better example of a long, long bed, and then just repeating that pattern all the way down, which is just beautiful. Like, I love these. Absolutely stunning. And then I'm going to talk about a bonus tip really quick. So when we're picking plants, I know this can be overwhelming for many of us. One place I do suggest that you start once you have a list is, the form, texture, color, but sometimes it's hard to come up with the list in general. And I actually have a blog post on this too, but one thing I do suggest is you create a plant list of potential plants that you could use. So for instance, my backyard is shady, okay? I have a little bit of sun, so I would say it's like dappled sunlight. So instead of getting overwhelmed with what plants can I use, I've created a long list of potential plants that I could use. Some short plants for the ground cover, some medium plants, some taller plants. And I don't necessarily use everything on that list. I just make a list. So maybe you're designing a perennial border and it's full sun, it's dry, and you want everything to be pink and white. Maybe you make a potential plant list of things that you could use. And then maybe it's 50 plants to start, but then you narrow it down to maybe the 5 or 10 or 20 best plants that give you the texture, the form, and the color that you want. So sometimes I just make that long list to start, and then I start working with that to design it. Sometimes I know it gets overwhelming with plants, so that's just one way to go about kind of narrowing down that list. And of course, the most important thing is to experiment and have fun. If something doesn't work, it's okay to move a plant. And I know a lot of you probably do that already. I have a beautiful friend that would buy a plant and then she would think about it for weeks and she wouldn't be sure where to put it. And then she would ask us and then she still wouldn't make a decision. And then it would sit there for days and weeks and it wouldn't be put in the ground. So I understand for a tree, you have to think about that a little bit more because it's not as easy to move a tree. But in terms of perennials, don't feel bad. Just go ahead and try something. And then if it, a year later, you're like, this doesn't work, then just move it. And that's perfectly okay. That happens to me all the time. But experiment, try different things. Like there are so many fun things that you can do. This is in Seattle. There's just some great, beautiful designs that you can try with low plants, tall plants. I will often buy plants that are on sale that are not even blooming because I just am intrigued by them. I've a lot of the plants in my garden I've never heard of before. I just bought them on sale. And I of course, I bought 3 at least or 5 to have a mass of them. And some of the best plants, that I've learned are plants that I just took a chance on. Some of them didn't work out. Some of them died, but some did really well. So again, planting design is such a fun thing. See it as an art form. This is a neighbor down the street. Their yard's always beautiful when we walk down there. But you can do so many beautiful things with plants. And if you think about form, texture, color, and the massing and all of those things and experimenting, you can do some awesome things.